Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our second class in the series. And today, I know people are very, very eager for the flood. Unfortunately, we're not doing the flood until like next week. Yeah, I need some time for the flood. Today, this evening, what we're going to be doing is, someone mute yourself. Okay. Oh, I do want to say something. Because we're using the Yedidia link, I can't mute anyone else. So I'm going to rely on you guys to mute yourselves. Because I can't mute you if I know, even if I realize where it's coming from, I can't do anything. Okay. And this class should be recorded. It's supposed to be recorded automatically to the cloud. Then I'm going to download it. Okay. And upload it to the public Facebook page. Okay, so that anyone who's missing it, that's what I'll keep doing. I hope that this works. This is the experiment. Hopefully it will work, and then this is going to be our link moving forward. Okay, but I'll confirm with all you guys. All you guys will know. Now, again, if anyone's not on the email list and wants to be, please, here, I'll type my email in the chat box. Please drop me an email. Okay, and this way you will know about any changes in, for example, in the Zoom link, you'll get handouts. It's good to be on the email list, or you can join the Facebook group. I post handouts to the Facebook group also. So everything's kind of double posted, but a lot of people find it easier to deal with the email. Okay, so what we're doing today is we're going to look at the story of Adam and Chava, Adam and Eve. We're going to first, in this case, now I use different shitot depending on what we're doing. So in this case, we're going to look at the biblical text first, just the biblical text. And then I'm going to bring in some parallels from Gilgamesh, specifically the origin of Enkidu, okay, who is Gilgamesh's buddy, his rival and then his buddy, okay? So, and is in fact the impetus in the Gilgamesh epic for us learning the whole story of the flood, because Enkidu dies, Gilgamesh he says, oh my God, people can die, this is horrible, I don't want to die, how do you live forever? And he goes to Utnapishtim, who is this guy who can live forever. He's like, how is that you live forever? And he's the Noah in the flood story in Gilgamesh. So that's how the flood story is brought into Gilgamesh. But right now we're going to be focusing on Adam and Chava. What is the story actually about? I'm going to start with the creation of Adam. Okay, we're going to go through it, really the pshat, not all the layers that we've layered on top. Okay, so we're going to look at the pshat. What do the words say? What's actually going on in the story, and what's it trying to explain? Okay. Now, another note for anyone who, I don't know if we have any new viewers, but if we do, please write any questions or comments in the chat, okay? And when I get to a natural break, I'll look at the chat and I'll answer your questions, okay? All right, and so we begin. I am reading from Perek Bet Zion, so that's chapter 2:7, okay? It's the creation of man in chapter 2, okay? Vayitzer Hashem Elohim et Adam afar min ha'adama. And God created man from dust of the earth. Vayipach ba'apav nishmat chayim. And he blew into him a breath of life. Vayihi hadam lenefesh chaya. And the person became a living being. Vayita Hashem Elohim gan be'eden mikedem. Vayasem sham et Adam asher yatzar. God planted a garden in primordial Eden, and he placed the Adam there that he had created. I do want to say, for those who missed my last class, again, that I take stories that are presented as prehistory. They're not presented as historic in the biblical text as kind of emblematic and trying to explain things, as opposed to looking at them as if they were historical stories. Okay, that's not true for all of Breshit. There are absolutely stories that are being presented as if this is a natural thing that happened. But I think the stories are, especially before the flood and even some after, are meant, particularly before Abraham, are really meant to be these kind of emblematic stories that are explaining specific things or shining a light on certain aspects of usually of humanity. Okay, so God makes a garden, he puts a person there, okay? And God made grow from the earth every tree that's nice to see and good to eat. And the tree of life was in the garden, and also the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. What is the knowledge of good and evil? Okay, so many commentators have talked about this because of what happens in the story. But I am actually, again, going to refer to Kasuto here. He says, let's look and see how this phrase is used biblically. In the Bible, when we see these phrase, what does it mean? And in the Bible, what it means, lo ladat tovara, right? When it says, was talking to the new generation that's born after the initial generation is killed because of the miraglim, because they sinned with the spies. So then the new generation says, "Oh, you were loyal to eat." They say the new generation that don't know tovara. They don't know anything. To ladat tovara is to know anything. Okay, so and we're going to see that, of course, Adam and Chava have a kind of an innocence that is really not knowing anything. It's a baby's innocence in a way, okay? In a way. So here's a tree of knowledge of good and evil, and also the tree of life. So then we have the rivers, etc. We have gold. We have all these wonderful things. I'm skipping, okay, to Tetvav, verse 15. And God took man and he put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and to keep it. Okay, now this is kind of important in what we have in like the Atreus and the creation myth that we have in Akkadian. The purpose of people are created because the lesser gods are getting sick and tired of feeding the upper gods. And they're like, oh, well, we'll make people and they'll give sacrifices. And that's the purpose. That's why God creates people. It's not the purpose of people, it's why gods create them, right? Here, the purpose of man is to keep this garden. Right? He said, from every tree, and he says to Adam, from every tree of the garden you shall surely eat. Okay, but you shall not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, because on the day that you eat from it, you will surely die. Okay, now, what was the other tree? What tree has disappeared? Not a trick question.
Ladat Tovara.
No, that we have. We have a commandment. But we have another important tree. Tree of life. Tree of life is not mentioned here, right? There's no commandment not to eat from the tree of life, right? It sounds and the supposition is that Adam just doesn't know what the tree of life is. He just doesn't know it's there. We need to know that it's there because it's going to come up later. So we, the reader, need to know that there's this tree of life, right? But Adam has nothing to do with it at this point. Okay. All right. And then Vayomer Shelohim lo tov heyot adam levado eselo ezer kinegdo. And God says, it's not good for man to be alone. I will make him a helpmeet. Vayitzar Hashem Elohim min ha'adama kol chayat hasadeh vet kol of hashamayim vayaveh el ha'adam l'ot ma yikra lo. So God made from the earth all the animals of the field and all the birds of heaven, and he brought them to man, to Adam, to see what he would call them. V'chol asher yikra lo ha'adam nefesh chaya hu shmo. And everything that Adam called it, a living being, that was its name. Now, this also makes a little bit more sense on the background of again, the ancient Near Eastern approach, which is naming things is somehow knowing them. In other words, they would have just lists of names. They're like, here's a list of things made of wood. Like we literally find documents like this. List of things made of wood. And it's list, right? Because as soon as you say the name, you somehow know something about it. So here, Adam's going to name them. He's going to recognize them. He's going to know them, not biblically, right? But why is God doing this? What's the implication? Well, it becomes clearer, right, in the next verse. Vayikra Adam shemot l'chol habeima u'le'of hashamayim, and Adam gave names to all the animals and to all the birds of the sky, u'le'chol chayat hasadeh, to all the animals of the field. U'la'adam lo matza ezer kenegdo, but Adam didn't find a helpmeet, right? In other words, he checked out all the animals, and none of them were doing it for him. Like, it was not going to happen, right? So he needs something else, right? He needs someone like him, okay? So God put he kind of put a comb on him. He put him to sleep. And he took one of his ribs and he closed the flesh around it. And he took the side that he took from Adam, he made into a woman. And he brought her to Adam. And so the man said, he gives this little poem. He says, this time, what do you mean this time? I saw all the animals. Forget it, right? This time, she's a bone from my bones. She's like me, right? And flesh of my flesh. This is going to be called a woman because it's taken from a man. It's going to be called an isha because it's taken from an ish. We're the same thing. We're part of the same thing, okay? As opposed to all the animals, right? Al Cain, Yazov ishet aviv et imo v'davak b'ishto v'ayu levasar echad. Therefore, a man will leave his father and mother and stick to his wife, and they'll become one flesh. Literally, right? You got the piece taken away, and you come back together, right? Like you have in, Aristophanes says in Plato's Symposium, right? You're split. If you have a midrash like that too, but the midrash is later than the Symposium. That they were made with, it kind of made double, and then they're split, and then you need to be together, and that's why you fall in love and you get married. Here it's less kind of ridiculous than this picture of a creature with four arms and four legs and then split down the middle. But it is this idea that yes, we're part of the same thing, and now we're coming back together. Okay. Vayushneim, now we get to our story, but I'm going to take a pause because I see questions coming in. So Gershon says, although the tree of life is identified, there is no commandment not to eat from it. Correct. It is only after Adam and Eve eat from the tree of knowledge that God expresses a concern that they will eat from the tree of life. Right. Would it have been permissible for them to eat from it if they hadn't been ejected from the garden? Well, you know that, of course, there are midrashim, etc., that say that God was planning to feed them from the tree of life, right? And then they live forever, right? In the story, what it sounds like is they're so clueless, they're not going to know what. I mean, this is my interpretation. I have to say it's not direct, but that they're so clueless, they're not going to know where the tree of life is. If they're smart, they get some basic wisdom, they can figure out what the tree of life is, right? And then they'll eat from it. So they're not. And what's interesting is, you're right, they're allowed to eat from the tree of life. It has consequences, though, that God doesn't like. The same way, if you remember last class, there wasn't necessarily anything strictly evil about people building a tower, right? But God said, they started to build a tower. God's like, I don't want them to build this tower. They're not spreading out. I don't want them to build this tower. So I'm spreading them out, right? It was less of a punishment and more of a consequence, right? It appears that not only is Adam naming living things, but by virtue of naming them, he's deciding what a living thing is and what is not. For instance, Adam is not naming viruses. Well, he's not naming viruses just because he's not going to be able to see viruses, right? It doesn't mention the creeping things, but we don't have creeping things in this version, right? We don't have in this kind of creation story. There are no creeping things because you don't want creeping things in your garden anyway. It's just talking about animals and birds. I don't think he's really I don't think he's meant to decide. I understand why you read that into the verse. I understand why you say that when it says nefesh chaya, that what if he names it, then it's considered a living being. It's an interesting idea that, it's saying that if a person can't relate to it, it doesn't count as alive, like maybe, right? You could say that. I think it's just saying this is true for all the living beings. In other words, he went through all the living beings. We don't care about the inanimate stuff. He went through all the living beings and he named them. Okay, continuing. Excuse me. Okay. So now I am in the very end of Bet Chaf. It's Bet Chaf Hey, so it's 225. Okay. Vayu shnehem arumim hadam v'ishto v'lo yitbashashu. Okay, the two of them were naked. They weren't embarrassed. V'anachash haya arum, and this is cute because it's using the same word to mean something different. And the snake was sneaky, right? He was kind of crooked. Mikol chayat hasadef, more than all, or less sneaky and just more smart, right? Than all the animals of the field. Asher asa Hashem Elohim, that God made. Vayomer el haisha, and he said to the woman, Af ki amar Elohim lo tochlu mikol etz hagan. Is it true that God said you can't eat from any tree in the garden? But Tomer isha nachash mipriha etz hagan nochel. And the woman said to the snake, yeah, sure, we can eat from the fruit of the trees. But from the fruit of the tree that's in the middle of the garden, God said, don't eat from it and don't touch it, lest you die. Now, of course, in the Midrash and the commentaries on the story, it's Adam added a law, and that causes all sorts of problems because Adam told her you can't touch it. Whatever, she is expressing an expanded version. Vayomer hanachash el haisha lo mo temutun, and the snake says to the woman, you shall surely not die. Okay, now I do want to say something. I've said this before in different contexts. If you guys are familiar, there's an approach. And it seems pretty clearly true that the Masoretes, the Baalei Masorah, when they were putting the ta'amim in, there's actually a level of interpretation that you can see in the ta'amim. In other words, the way you read it with the ta'amim sometimes adds a layer of interpretation. Now, I think that they were actually doing that here because normally you would read lo mot temutun all together, right? You would say, no, you will surely not die. You have to read all three words together to get the plain meaning. But if you look at the Ta'amin, it says lo mot temutun, right? And I think they're doing something clever where they're saying the snake is double-tongued, right? And the snake is saying, it sounds like he's saying you shall surely not die. But what he's saying is, immortal one, you will die. Lo mot temutun, right? And that's kind of a clever thing. Like we're going to punctuate it differently so you see that the snake's kind of playing both sides. Okay. So why won't you die? So he's now going to explain you're not actually going to die, but I'm going to explain why God doesn't want you eating from this thing. Okay. Ki yodeh Elohim ki biyom achalcha mimenu v'nifkachu enechem v'yitem kelohim yodeh tov v'ra. Because God knows that on the day you eat from it, your eyes will be open. You'll be like gods, and you'll know good and evil, knowing good and evil. Vatera haisha ki tova etzlemacha v'chitavahu le'enayim. So the woman saw that it seemed good to eat. It's pretty. V'nechmar ha'etz lahaskil, and the tree is nice to contemplate. V'tikach mipriyo v'tocha, and she took from its fruit and she ate. V'titen gam le'isha ima v'yochal, and she gave it to Adam with her, and he ate. Okay. V'tipakachna einei shnehem, and the eyes of both of them were opened. V'yed'u ki erumimhem, and they knew that they were naked. V'yitperu alei teina v'asu lehem chagorot, and they made, and so they sewed together fig leaves, and they made themselves what do you call them? Loincloths. They made themselves loincloths. Vayishma'u et kol Hashem Elohim mitalech bagan l'ruach hayom. And they heard the noise of God going about in the garden in the wind of the day, like let's say the late afternoon. Now, I don't know, some of you may be familiar. There was a note by Niehaus. He wanted to say that the yom here is not day, but is storm. Like in Svanya, do I have it? Here it is. In Svanya 2:2, Svanya bet, it's B'terem ledet chok kimotz avar yom, right? And in that pasuk, yom means storm. And he wanted to say this is not just God kind of going about. Rather, this is what's called a theophany. This is like a God coming in a storm and a wind and the thunder and lightning. That's what this is. There are two problems with this. I'm really citing an article from 2001 now. There are two problems with this. One is that there's not a lot of theophany language in here. Niehaus points to theophany language, but it doesn't. Usually when you have this thing of God coming, you have lightning and thunder. It doesn't just kind of give a little hint that there's this God's appearing in this major storm. That's one thing. And the other thing, which you can take or leave as an argument, is that absolutely no translation at all, early translation, meaning the Septuagint, Targum Neofiti, all the very earliest translations that we have, none of them said, translate this as storm in any way. They all saw it as walking in the afternoon when there's wind, when there's a breeze. That you can kind of say, well, maybe, it's a very unusual use of yom, even if you have it in Svanya. By the way, it's connected to the Akkadian umu, which is like, oh yeah, this is great. Whenever you can find a word in Akkadian, and it makes it so much better. But it doesn't seem to actually be a theophany. And Adam and his wife hid from God in the Garden of Eden. And God said to Adam, he said, where are you? And I do want to say something about where are you? People are like, oh, why was God saying, where are you? Doesn't God know? And the answer is, sure, God knows. If I'm supposed to meet my brother at 8 and it's 8:30 and he's not there, and I call him up and I say, where are you? What is the answer going to be? His answer is not going to be, I'm still at home. His answer is going to be an explanation of why he's not where I am now, right? So because that's where he's supposed to be. So God says, where are you? He's like, what is, explain yourself. And that's what Adam takes it as. He says, I heard the noise of your noise or your voice in the garden. And I was frightened because I'm naked, so I hid. And God said, who told you that you're naked? Did you eat from the tree I told you specifically not to eat from? Now, this kind of shines a light on what is Eitz Hadat Tov Hara. What does he know now that he didn't know? He knows he's naked. What does it mean to be naked? An animal is never naked, right? Unless it's like Disney, right? An animal is never naked, okay? Because an animal is just an animal. But people can be naked. Why? Because people live beyond a state of nature, right? So he's gotten an understanding that's beyond the state of nature of being with the animals. Remember where we started, where he's like being introduced to all the animals because he doesn't have a mate. Well, that's absurd. But what it's pointing out is, at that point, Adam is one teeny level above animals, okay? And he's going to get further and further from animals. Kind of spoiler alert, at least in my opinion, this distance from animals grows also through the flood, and we'll discuss it a little bit when we get to the flood story. Also through the flood, until after the flood, man's allowed to eat animals, and then that's it. He's not like with the animals at all. right? But until that point, there's this gradual distancing of people from animals until the final cut that happens with the flood, with the recognition that people can be corrupt, whereas animals are just animals. And so if you keep them integrally linked, everything is going to go to hell, right? You have to distance people who are corruptible from animals that are just animals. You can't destroy the whole world for people's corruption. And that is the final straw. Now people can actually eat animals. There's nothing further than that. Okay, going back to our source here. So what the Eitz gave him was this kind of knowledge of, oh, I'm naked. I'm not an animal, right? There's this thing that I have parts that shouldn't be exposed. Okay. And God, as soon as he says that, God knows what he did, right? That's the idea. Vayomer Hadam, Haisha Sher Natata Imadi, he natnali min ha'etz v'ochel. Right? As soon as God comes with the accusation, he's like, the woman that you gave me, that you put with me, she gave me from the tree and I ate. There's this great painting. I don't remember who did it, but it's like a class, kind of like a classical, and it's Adam's going like, you know, like pointing at Chava, like, yo, what was I supposed to do? You know, but this is the initial response. Vayomer Hashem Elohim la'isha mazot asit. So God turns to the woman. He says, "What did you do?" Vatomer ha'isha hanachash hishiani bocha. Right. So it's the snake's fault. The snake led me to eat it. Vayomer Hashem Elohim hanachash ki asita zot aror atami kol be'am. He says it's the snake. And here we're going to see the consequences. So what are the consequences of this action? Consequences / punishment, right? Because it absolutely seems to be a punishment. It says, you are cursed from more than every animal. And from every domesticated animal and from every animal of the field. You're going to travel on your belly. And you're going to eat dirt your whole life. Uven zaracha uven zar'a hu yishufcha rosh v'ata tishufenu hakeh. So what am I going to do? What's we call midah keneged midah, right? Tit for tat here. That the punishment is going to be. You were so chummy with the woman, right? That you were giving her advice and telling her to eat the fruit. So now there's going to be eternal enmity between you and the woman, and her children are going to try to kill you, and you're going to try to kill them. Right? They're going to try and smash your head. You're going to try and bite their ankles. Okay. So from now on, because you were so chummy with a woman, now you're going to be completely at odds with each other. El Haisha Amar. So what's going to happen to the woman? Harba arbe itzfonech veheronech be'etzev taldi banim be'ishech tishukatech v'hu yimshol bach. A lot to unpack here. Okay. He said to the woman, he said, I am going to increase your suffering, right? And your suffering in your pregnancy, you're going to give birth in pain, okay? And your desire is going to be to your husband, and he will therefore rule over you. Because I'm gonna split this verse in two. Let's first talk about the pain in giving birth. This is something that's not completely unique to people, but fairly unique to people, that the tremendous danger it is to a woman to give birth. Okay, there's that a woman, it's very, very painful in a way that it isn't for animals. Why? Two things, okay? We've got big heads and we walk on 2 feet. Because we walk on 2 feet, so we have a pelvis that's relatively narrow so we can balance, right? And we've got our big heads that have to get out, right? So that combination causes the tremendous pain of childbirth. Okay, pain, trouble, sometimes death. I'm not saying that there weren't other causes and it wasn't better before, like in that thing in between where doctors got involved and started infecting all the women giving birth. That, okay, besides putting that aside, it was still a dangerous activity, right? And it was certainly painful. It was always painful. This is something that separates human women from animals, right? Animals just give birth. Yes, sometimes there's a breach, sometimes, but in general, you expect them to just give birth. They just do it on their own. No one needs to help them. No one needs to go like push, I mean, I'm sure the farmers will say, yeah, you have to do something, right? But it's not like a human woman. A human woman is in tremendous pain, right? This is something that separates people from animals. Okay. And Uladam Amar, and what's going to happen to man, right? To the person, to Adam. Kishamata lekol ishtecha b'tochal min ha'etz. Sorry, I skipped the second half. V'ishech teshukatech v'hu yimshal bach. In the biblical kind of setup, if you desire something, it rules over you. Okay, so she's going to desire her husband, and he's therefore going to rule over her, right? We're actually, I don't think we're going to look at it. Just so you know, with Cain, right? When God says to Cain, he talks about sin. He uses an identical construction, okay, which is that sin desires you, and therefore you can rule over it. All right, and it is probably that identical construction that later on feeds this idea that woman is sin, because it's an identical construction, right? The sin desires him and he will rule over, so he can rule over it. Woman desires man and he will rule over her. Okay. Ramban gives an interesting explanation of this verse. He's like, what does this mean? He says, it kind of gives us a glimpse of what life was for a woman in the Middle Ages, even in a man's eyes. He said, look, he's like, no slave wants to be a slave. No slave runs after a master and says, take me as a slave. Slaves don't want to be slaves, right? And people also generally don't want to risk their lives. They usually don't want to risk their lives. And yet women get married and they want to have children, right? This desire is the curse of Eve, right? This irrational desire to get married, like women want to get married and they want to have kids. And this is, from the Ramban's point of view, completely irrational. So that's an interesting view. I'm going to move on. So what is Adam's punishment? Uladam amar ki shamata l'koshtacha v'tochal min ha'etz asher tziviticha lemor lo tochal mimenu, because you listened to your wife and you ate from the tree that I commanded you, saying you should not eat from it. The earth is going to be cursed because of you. You're going to eat with sadness all the days of your life. The coats of the dardar tatzmiach lach. You're going to go with thorns. You're going to eat the grass of the fields. With the sweat of your brow, you will eat bread. Ad shuvcha el hadama. Until you return to the earth because you were taken from it. Ki afarata, because you're dirt. Ve'afarta shuv, and you're going to return to dirt. Okay, so first of all, God's angry, you can tell. But also, again, what is the punishment for man? It's something that separates people from animals. Animals just go and eat. They don't grow things. They don't have to bake bread. They go and they eat. They eat whatever is in the field, whatever's on the trees. That's what Adam and Chava were doing, right? Just eat the fruit of the trees. Enjoy. Not anymore. Okay, not anymore. Now they're going to be cultivating the earth. It's hard work, right? And they're going to be eating bread. They're going to be making their own food, something that animals do not do. Okay? Vayikra Adam Shem Ishto Chava, ki hi hayta em kol chai. And now he finally gives her a name. She's been the woman. She's been a woman this whole time. This whole time she's been the woman, right? The woman, his wife, whatever, however you want to say. Now she gets a name. All the animals got names in the beginning. Now she gets a name, okay? There's just Chava, because she is the mother of all life. I think that this statement in itself is also meaningful, because is she the mother of all life? No. He knows that there's plenty of life that she's not the mother of. She's not going to be the mother of rabbits. She's not going to be the mother of goats. There's lots of living things she's not the mother of. But the living things that count, He's not an animal anymore. We're people and we're something else. You're the mother of everything living, because everything living, from my point of view, are people. Right? Of course, she hasn't given birth to anyone yet, but put that aside, right? That's what she is. And God made Adam and his wife tunics of leather, and he dressed them. Okay? So now they are not naked, and God himself dressed them. Now this is interesting because, of course, we asked, was the snake right? Was the snake speaking the truth when he said to Chava, you guys, if you eat, you're going to be like gods, right? You're not going to die at all, right? Your eyes are going to be open, and you'll be like gods. So what does God say? He says, Hen Adam hayakachad mimenu. Adam was like one of us now. Ladat tov hara, knowing good and evil. Vata pen yishlach yado v'lakach gam me'etz hachayim. And now lest he stretch out his arm and also take from the tree of life, v'achal v'chai lo'olam, and would eat and live forever. V'yishalcheu Hashem Elohim migan Eden lavodet adama asher lukach misham. So God sent him out from the Garden of Eden to work the land that he had been taken from, like he had been taken from the earth, right? Vayigaresh et Adam v'ashken mikedem legan Eden et kruvim v'etlat hacherav hametapechet l'shmor et derech etz hachayim. So God doesn't just take him out; He puts angels to guard the Garden of Eden, so that there's no way he's going to get back in. That's it. You're out of the Garden of Eden now. You're going to grow your own food, and you're not going to get anywhere near the tree of life, right? So it seems like the tree of life is something that once you know something, you'll recognize. But as it was, he had no clue. And the point is that this is, in a way, being godlike. This is, to know these things and to recognize these things is, in a certain way, a godlike essence of a person. Okay. I'm going to take a pause and read the comments, and then we're going to go to the Epic of Gilgamesh and the story of Enkidu, and we're going to see the similarities and differences. So this is a good time to ask questions about this story before we move on. And we're still going to talk a little bit about it, but this is the time. Okay. Creation is tov and tov ma'od. Adam being alone is the first time we hear lo tov. Right. I mean, yeah. Well said. But is eating animals placing humans above animal when animals eat each other? That's a good point. That's a good point. But I think part of the issue is that people, there's this idea, and which is reflected in the text, right? That before the flood, people were not allowed to eat animals. They weren't allowed to eat them, right? And the idea is kind of, who are you to eat animals? Like, right, you could say animals eat each other, so what's the big deal? But in those verses where it talks like that, it sounds like, yeah, before you couldn't eat animals, now go ahead. And it's not just that, it makes a distinction between animals and people. It says, you can eat animals, go ahead. You kill a person, you're gonna die, right? And it makes a distinction in that piece where they're being allowed to eat animals. So there's a very clear distinction there between animals and people. You can eat animals, but if you kill a person, you're dead. Okay, so but that's a good point. Is it possible to say that Adam and Chava knew only tov before eating the fruit? What changed after eating the fruit was that they now knew tov and ra. Look, I know that a lot. I mean, when I was a kid, that was one of the explanations, was that what did eating the fruit do? That beforehand they were all good and evil was only outside them, but once they ate it, they had this kind of good and evil inside, which is similar to what you're saying, I think. But I think it doesn't make that much sense in the story. Actually, I shouldn't say that. It's okay. I don't think it comes out of the plain meaning of the story. I think what comes out of the plain meaning of the story, and I am influenced by Cassuto here, I have to admit that, because he looks at where else you use this phrase. And the phrase is used for, like, little babies don't know Tov Hara because they don't know anything, right? That's how it's used. You were so little, you didn't know Tov Hara. Right? Which actually works with the way it's being explained here. Little babies don't learn like, oh no, I'm naked, right? They don't think that way. So it's this idea of kind of knowing anything, knowing something. Of course, it is also true that how is knowing anything godlike? Like, how is that What, they don't know everything now, do they? Or do they? We don't know. In your opinion, are Adam and Chava not specific people? And if not, how does it relate to Genesis chapter 5, which seems to be written as historical fact? Okay, this is what I mean. What I mean is, okay, so the genealogies, yeah, they're rough. Okay, I can't like explain genealogies. And it's worse because it's kind of a double genealogy, which makes it even harder to get. I'm Lemech, please, right? But what I'm saying is, particularly when you have kind of a fleshed out story like this, again, if someone says, I take this literally, I'm like, cool, I'm not going to argue with them. Like that's silly. You can't argue, right, with that idea. But I take this as explaining something, emblematic of something, right? So that the ideas, because there are all sorts of stories that really don't work as anything but emblematic, right? And you know,
can I ask you a question about that, about chapter 5, and also there's genealogy about Noach, and people seem to have a very long life, and which is shortened.
Yes, right, which is shortened.
And also at the end of Bereshit, there's something God's saying that He limits the life to 20 years.
In chapter 6, in verses 1 to 4, it says Vav Aleph Tadal. In that piece in the middle, God says He's limiting people to 120 years, but they're not limited afterwards to 120 years.
Well, gradually,
gradually. But it sounds like it's going to be right away, and it's not. I'm going to actually discuss that piece, those 4 verses, at length in a separate class. I promise you the flood next week, so maybe we'll do it after the flood. But that in itself, I see. So, for example, that statement of God that people are only going to live 120 years, placed almost as a non sequitur in the middle of the story of the Nephilim, seems to be making a statement that these Giborim of old were just people and they weren't divine, like that. But we'll talk about it more there. So that's what I mean by emblematic. Like, in other words, if for me, you say, well, they aren't 120 years after, I'm like, but what that statement was saying was not really, let's count the years. What it was really saying was, we're in the middle of a story talking about these characters that seem to be almost like demigods, and I'm telling you, they're not. They die, right? So like, but we'll talk about it more there, because it's a very unusual thing to have right in the middle of the story. So yes, the long, from my point of view, those long lives are telling you this is being presented as prehistory. Does prehistory mean that it's completely false? No, but it means that it's not something that you'd set your watch by, right? In other words, in the ancient world as well, they're like, okay, this is the history. Here are the last 5 kings, and these are the 10 kings before the flood, right? So they have this idea of there's a prehistory, and whether that prehistory, now I'm not saying that they would say that's not true, right? But I'm saying that there is this kind of legendary, we still have this idea, those are the legends of old and and it's kind of a little bit more legendary. I take it more seriously than the legend, and I think that it's saying real things. But I wouldn't necessarily sign off that something happened in a specific year, the year of Canaan this year, like, okay, maybe, but I don't think that's necessarily the point in this part of Bereshit. But we can continue talking about this throughout the course. Okay. Also, how does chapter 2 relate to chapter 1, where man is commanded to rule over animals and fish? Again, I mean, it's very easy to kind of just take the Rav Soloveitchik out, right? But it's not. It's more. You have a different idea of what is the place of a person in creation, right? Is he kind of the pinnacle of creation, or does he have a job, right? And it is a different, is he in a way, is he just the last thing that's created? He's the last thing, so you could say he's the pinnacle of creation, but he's just the last thing. Or is it all for him? He's in the garden. God makes, everything grow, because man, and then man both benefits from it, and his job is to guard it, right? So where man is kind of very much at the center of the earth and his idea of the world, right? And the idea is that it's both created for him and it's his responsibility, right? And you can go more into, because there's right, the idea of man being active as opposed to passive, spiritual as opposed to physical. So I do think you can take these two accounts and kind of put them side by side, because the order in them, of course, is different. But the point of the order is also pretty clear in each version. And that's what I mean by emblematic. So like you say, okay, what is the point of saying that a man was on, that it was before there was anything growing on earth that God made man? Why? Because there's no point to things growing on earth if there's no man, right? In the second version, right? Whereas in the first version, you have the whole world, everything, and man's just the last thing. And you can argue about what that means, right? But does everything exist just because of man? Or does everything exist because God wants it to exist? And God said it's going to be existing, and then the last thing that God made was man, right? So it's a different idea of what is the role of man on earth, and are we looking at creation as a pure, really completely centered on the divine, and we're just the last thing, or does God just want it all for us, right? That's just on off the top of what I think. I didn't particularly prepare that, but those are things, and that's the sort of thing you can argue about already. But I think that's how I see the two different stories. So for example, I don't have a real problem with it, right? I think they're presenting two different ideas. Okay, so I'm moving on now. For those of you who got handouts, right? But I'm going to read it out loud. So for those of you who don't have handouts, you will understand what I am reading. Okay, so now I'm going to go to the Gilgamesh epic. Okay, so the Gilgamesh, the Epic of Gilgamesh. The Epic of Gilgamesh is very, very old, and I made the mistake of not writing down the year, because you know me in years, I always get the year wrong if I try to just memorize it. So I will see if I can just find it quickly. No, I cannot, of course, but you can easily look it up. The Gilgamesh epic it's based on a Sumerian. It's written in Akkadian, okay, but Sumerian, which was from before Akkadian. We have a Sumerian poem about Gilgamesh, and it's quite clear from the names. Like Enkidu was a Sumerian name, so it's older. The stories, the start of the legend, as it were, is much older even than the Akkadian text we have. What we're going to be looking at is the first tablet. For those of you who got the hint, the first tablet, which is it says the Assyrian one. That's like the standard Gilgamesh epic that is kind of a later Babylonian version, which is in its full form. Everyone fills in the second tablet from the older Old Babylonian copy that we have. Old Babylonian, that's Hammurabi. Okay, Hammurabi writes in Old Babylonian Akkadian. So just to put, okay, so the standard epic, is in later Babylonian, still early, but we're filling in the second column with Old Babylonian. Okay, so I'm going to start reading not from the very beginning. I'm going to start reading from the first tablet. I'm going to I would like to say that, what do I want to say? Okay, so let me give you a little bit of background. We're not going to read the whole thing inside. What happens? Gilgamesh, he's a king and he's a tyrant, right? And he's going to be the hero, right? It starts with how wise Gilgamesh is, and he's the man who saw everything, and he's a tyrant. He's terrible, and the gods are like, and women are complaining, right? Because he's keeping everyone as kind of working for him. It's not clear. They going to war, but men and women, young men and young women can't do what they want to do. They can't go back home and help their families. They all have to serve him. And people are complaining, and the gods say, you know what? They say to Aruru. Oh, let me read it from this. I'll read from the critical edition. Just a second. Okay. Yeah. So they say what Gilgamesh needs is he needs a guy to oppose him, because he's really strong. He's amazing. He needs someone who's going to actually be his kind of not exactly rival to fight against him. So they say to Aruru, they say, "You made man, make someone who's going to be against Gilgamesh." So I'm reading. This you don't have. This piece you don't have. When Aruru heard this, she fashioned Anu's idea in her heart. Aruru washed her hands. She took a pinch of clay. She threw it down in the wild. In the wild, Enkidu, the hero, an offspring of silence. Apparently an offspring of silence because there were no mothers crying over him. There's no one, because it was just him, right? Knit strong by Ninurta. All his body is matted with hair. He is adorned with tresses like a woman. The locks of his hair grow as thickly as the sabbats. He knows not at all a people, nor even a country. He was clad in a garment like Shakan's, feeding on grass with the very gazelles. In other words, he's naked. Jostling at the water hole with the herd, he enjoyed the water with the animals. So he's actually with the herd. He doesn't see a difference between himself and them. Okay, and the hunter sees this guy, and the hunter, he goes back home to his father. His father says, "Tell Gilgamesh." And Gilgamesh is like, "Okay, I know what we do with this wild man who is just with the animals. I know how to civilize this real fast." Okay. So what is his idea? This part you have. The version that I gave you is from Pritchard, Ancient Near Eastern Texts. Okay, it's an old version. It's much cleaner than the later critical edition, I have to say. So it's a little easier to read for that reason. I will note certain things that are a little bit different in the critical edition. Just a moment, please. Yeah. Right. Okay, so I'm reading from line 40 in the first page that you have. Okay. So Gilgamesh says to the hunter, "Go, my hunter, take with thee a harlot lass." Actually, she has a name. It's not harlot lass. It's the harlot. Tell you the name. It's of course super important. The harlot Shamchat. Okay, her name is Shamchat. So he's saying, "Take with thee the harlot Shamchat." Okay. When he waters the beast at the watering place, she shall pull off her clothing, leaving bare her ripeness. It goes a little bit more detail than just ripeness. Okay. So she's going to get completely naked, and then as soon as he sees her, he will draw near to her. Reject him will his beasts that grew up on his step. In other words, what's the plan? Plan is he's gonna be overcome with lust. He is going to have relations with her, and then the animals won't have any bit of him anymore. Okay, and in fact, this is what happens. Okay, she was not bashful. She welcomes order. She does her work because that's her job. And in fact, right afterwards, and I'm reading from line. If you go down in section 4, line 23, after he had his fill of her charms, he set his face toward his wild beasts. He's like, "Okay, I'm done. I'm going back to my gazelles," right? On seeing him, Enkidu, the gazelles ran off. The wild beasts of the steppe drew away from his body. Startled was Enkidu as his body became taut. His knees were motionless, for his wild beasts had gone. Enkidu had to slacken his pace. It was not as before. But he now had wisdom, broader understanding. Now, wisdom is it's temu, like from ta'am, right? But it's reconstructed. But broader understanding is not. So it's not necessarily that he now had. It's he had wisdom, broader understanding. So it's not clear, even though it says here now, it's not clear, did he gain wisdom or he had wisdom so he understood something was going on, right? Returning, he sits at the feet of the harlot. He looks over the face of the harlot. And it keeps on saying her name. It doesn't just call her the harlot. The harlot says to him, "Enkidu, thou art wise, Enkidu, art become like a god. Why with the wild creatures do you roam over the steppe? So the idea is this: he had relations with a woman. Now he's not an animal. Okay. This is his first step to being a person. All right. His first step to being a person is mating with a woman. Now he's been with a woman. The animals are like, you're not one of us, buddy. And they went away. Okay. So what happens then is, let me go to the next tablet, which you have on the next page. And this is restored from the Old Babylonian, from what's called the Pennsylvania tablet, but everyone restores it from the older Babylonian. We don't have this in the later version. It starts with the same, again, it's parallel. So it starts with the same thing. He has relations with her, and with one piece. So what does it say? If you look in line, I'm in section 2, line 27. Okay, this is after they had relations. She pulled off her clothing. With one piece, she clothed him. With the other garment, she clothed herself. In other words, what's going on? They were both naked because they both, were together. So they were both naked, but she's the only one with clothes. So she gives half her clothes to him because he's always been naked, right? But now he has clothes, okay? Step number 2, right? So he had relations with her. Now he's wearing clothing, right? And then it says, the milk of wild creatures he was wont to suck. I'm reading from at the bottom of the page. The milk of wild creatures he was wont to suck. Food they placed before him. It's not food. It's bread they placed before him. He gagged, he gaped, and he stared. Nothing does Enkidu know of eating bread. To drink strong drink, it's actually to drink ale. To drink strong ale, he has not been taught. He doesn't know to eat bread and drink beer, okay? Because these are two things that have to be cultivated by people, okay? So he, in the critical edition, it's like he's watching because he doesn't even know how to eat it. He's trying to figure out how to eat the bread because he's never encountered bread. So here's cultivated beer. This is step number 3, right? Enkidu ate the bread until he was sated. Of strong ale he drank 7 goblets. Carefree became his mood and cheerful. His heart exalted and his face glowed. He actually, in the critical edition, he actually starts singing. So what happens is, so he's great. He becomes a guardian for the shepherds. He's still in between kind of the fields and the settlement. And then to get him to Uruk, the city, what happens is that he has, in his destiny is to kind of meet Gilgamesh. So I'm just telling you because I've just given you a little piece of the story. His destiny is to have this conflict with Gilgamesh. So what happens is he hears that there's going to be a wedding, and Gilgamesh gets first rights. So Gilgamesh is going to have first rights with his bride, and Enkidu's like, that's not right. I'm going to stop this. So he goes to Uruk and he stops Gilgamesh from entering the bridal chamber, and they wrestle. And it seems like Gilgamesh wins because Enkidu says, oh yeah, you're like stronger than me or whatever. And they become really good friends. And then they're buddies, then they're friends. Okay, they're super, super close friends. But Gilgamesh also gets better, so everything's fine. But what we're seeing here, okay, so what we're seeing here is steps towards what makes a person not an animal. Okay, what makes a person not an animal? Okay, so on the one hand, it's relations with a woman. There are different people that say, well, this is society. It's based on society. It's based on the family. Whatever it is, this is considered the first critical step to not being an animal, right? The next step is wearing clothing, right? Because only animals are naked. And then it's eating cultivated bread, drinking cultivated beer, eating the stuff that people make, okay? That is part of being human, okay? And then finally going to the city, right? Then you're for sure, then you're really not an animal, right? Because you're in the city, you're in Uruk, right? So here, if we go back to our to what makes people in Adam and Chava, we see certain differences. We do see some similarities. So, for example, before we have kind of the real split with animals, it depends. We have the beginning of this split when Adam says, none of these animals are for me. None of these animals are for me. I need a woman. Like, he doesn't say I need a woman, but that's what he needs, right? So the fact that he needs a woman already is saying he's not an animal. He's not an animal because he needs a woman, right? But then they have to make a move, right, to get that knowledge, this knowledge that somehow separates them in some way, not just from animals, because it seems to be a lot more than that, right? We can't really figure out what it is in its entirety, even though we can guess. And there have been lots of guesses, but it's that knowledge now that makes him recognize in a situation like with Enkidu. So you have this prostitute who's like, oh, you don't have clothing, take half of mine, right? Because you need clothing because you're a person, right? Whereas in the story of Adam and Chava, this knowledge of good and evil opens their eyes and makes them recognize, no, we're naked, right? This is not something that we are human beings. We can't be like this. For us, this is naked, and we need clothing, right? And then the cultivation of produce is part of the consequences of their act, right? That they did this act, which made them recognize that they are not animals, that they need clothing. And now they're going to be even further. And part of this is that they need to cultivate food. So it's an interesting comparison in terms of what makes a person and not an animal, right? And of course, we also have the making from mud. We have that parallel as well. So I'm going to take up. So let me read your questions. This is. I'll have a conclusion, but this was the meat of it, right? So I'm finishing soon. Don't worry. Okay. On Shabbat, I was reading this stuff in the parsha, and I was excited to see a reference to Erech, which Hertz says is Uruk. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I always, and I've said this before, I think that there's so many kind of references that we miss in Tanakh as a whole, not just Bereshit, where we're missing references to much larger things that everyone knew. I do think that in certain cases, and we're going to talk about this a lot more when we talk about the flood, in certain cases, it's clear that the stories, or I think that the stories in Bereshit are responding to stories that everyone knew. And it's not like what you think. You think that the slave, saved from the flood, trick everyone and lie to them and tell them about a prophecy, and now everything's going to be great. And then you get into a ship and you give away all your stuff knowing that they're going to be dead in a day, right? That's what you think. That's what your story is. And our story is, no, Noach's a really great guy. That's how he gets saved, right? So I do think that there's a lot of, particularly in the stories in Bereshit, there's a lot of kind of playing with things that everyone knew, all right? And people that people were familiar with. And again, I'll remind you that I mentioned this in last class, Daniel, who is a major figure in Ugaritic narrative poetry, who's this wise judge. Yechezkel references him. And everyone just read it as Daniel, because what else could it be, right? Who is Daniel, right? As soon as we find this Daniel, we're like, oh yeah, because he's listing Daniel, Eov, and Noach. In other words, 3 righteous Gentiles, right? 3 righteous Gentiles. That's what he's doing. It's not Daniel. Daniel doesn't fit, right? But Daniel does. And we couldn't know it if we didn't find these texts. So who knows sometimes I wonder just how much things are referring to outside of the Tanakh itself. What is the meaning of emotion? What is the meaning of the idea that the knowledge which makes one human comes from sexual relations? So again, the question is, what about the sexual relations? Is it that it's a woman and not an animal, right? In other words, yeah, you're a human being because you were attracted to this woman. You weren't attracted to that goat, right? So that just shows that you're a woman, you're a human. And now the gazelles say, oh, whoa, he's a human now, because that's what he did. So now he's a human. I know that now. Is it just recognition? Or is there something about the founding of society, right? In other words, this is the unit of society. You being with a woman, a man, or I should say you, a man being with a woman is the foundation of human society, right? I wonder if it's just the more simple. Well, yeah, because you're a person. That's why you were attracted to this woman. Like, you know, because you're a man and that's a woman. Like you're not a gazelle, right? This should kind of prove it to you, right? Where in a similar way, where Adam is naming every animal and he doesn't find a helpmeet, and we're like, well, no kidding, he doesn't find one, right? But this says because he's a person, he's not an animal, right? So that's like the first kind of just a recognition. He's not actually an animal, right? Okay. Let's see. According to the narrative of Genesis 2, all this added knowledge is a sin to Adam. Dina, why do you say that? Is a sin to Adam? What do you mean? You mean?
What I mean is that
according. Okay, sorry.
That's me.
I'm sorry. I just looked at the name.
I think maybe that's a big difference that we see between Bereshit and the other story. A lot of the notions are the same, but in Bereshit you have the Eitz Hadat, and Eitz Hadat is that added knowledge, and that's something God says one thing you can't do, which is add knowledge. God doesn't want Adam to be this creature perhaps greater than animals. He wants Adam to be close to God, but then again, not add maybe technology or anything else to what he has.
Right. I think that's one of the difficult parts is that if we say, and it's a difficult, and I admit that part of this is a difficulty due to my interpretation, right? Is that if we say the whole point is separating humans from animals, this was something that it looks like God didn't want, right? Now we do have, again, I think it says in the Zohar that God was going to give them fruit from the Eitz Hadat on Shabbat, right? And then it would have been fine, right? And like God was going to feed it to them. Right. But honestly, it doesn't sound that way in the story. It sounds like they're not allowed to eat it. And so if that's the thing that makes them recognize and separates them from animals, that's like, wait, so it wasn't meant to be that way. And it's and frankly, this idea also, in my mind, is kind of also carried through with the flood story. Not with any sort of Gilgamesh, in that case, with really no parallel that I remember seeing in the ancient Near Eastern stuff, where with the idea that, okay, now I see, God's like, okay, now I see people are just bad. They're just bad from their youth. So I'm not going to destroy the world for them again, right? Well, what you destroyed the world for them the first time for exactly that reason, that people were bad. And the answer seems to be that, well, when that was, people were still so tied to the natural world that when they went bad, the whole natural world went corrupt and everything had to be destroyed. And God's like, you know what? People go bad all the time. They can't be that connected to the natural world. I can't let them influence the natural world that way. They're not tied together anymore. You know what, guys? Eat animals. You just better not kill people. Right? And it does have that tone of, it wasn't meant to be this way. You were meant to be much more in touch with nature. Now, I do think that some of this is reversed, right? If you look at the Torah as a whole, some of this is reversed with the idea of Yisrael returning to Eretz Yisrael, to Canaan, and or getting to Canaan rather, right? And the idea that they can be kicked out if they sin. In other words, here is a restoration of your basic connection to the land, that if you sin, it's all wiped out, right? That you're so connected that if you sin when you're in the land of Israel, you're all going to get kicked out, right? Because you can't live there anymore. And that seems to be, I think, that's kind of a return to this link to nature, which it sounds like was supposed to be the idea, like that was supposed to be the thing. But in this story, it's very problematic because like we do see this idea of recognizing that you're naked is kind of a good thing. Like I would think of being separate from animals as kind of a good thing in this case. Animals also have sex with members of their species, so why would a person doing that separate them from animals? Yeah, that's what. So that's what I mean by saying that it's simply a recognition that you're a person. Like a gazelle doesn't have relations with a pig, right? And you're hanging out with gazelles, but you weren't attracted to any gazelles. A woman came and removed her clothing, and that was it, right? So now everyone knows you're a person. Like Buddy, recognize it, you're a human being because that's a human woman, and you just had relations with her. So it, like in a very, very simplistic way, right? So that would be that idea. Like it's not super deep, but just kind of like this recognition of I am not that species, I am this species, and what drove it home was mating. Okay, so if there are no other questions, so let me just wrap up. So what we saw here, I want to kind of, and I have to say that tonight I am missing kind of the back and forth because I feel like a lot of you probably had a lot to ask and say in the middle that you didn't get a chance to. But I think what we saw, one of the things we saw, and that I sometimes have to emphasize, although maybe you guys are familiar with it already, is that the Adam and Eve story is not really about the origin of sin at all. Note that no consequence of this is, and now you're going to sin, right? Note that what it did come out of was disobedience to God. In other words, if there was no sin and there was no way to disobey God, they couldn't have eaten the fruit, right? But they ate the fruit, right? They ate the fruit because she ate the fruit because it looked good, but also because the snake told her it would be, it would open your eyes and do great things for you, right? So there isn't this idea that we have that frankly, it does exist in the Second Temple period, but it's really not popular with Jews, and it becomes a much more popular idea right after the Second Temple is destroyed in books like Fourth Ezra and Second Baruch, and of course Paul loves this idea, and then it's really taken on, and particularly in Western Christianity, this idea that the origin of sin is Adam's sin, right? That his sin is this kind of original sin for all people, and all people are simply repeating his sin or affected by his sin. Again, it did have some traction, a little traction in the Second Temple period, but it really was not a way people explained sin, and it became popular, particularly, it became popular apparently among Jews right after the destruction. And if you look at the plain meaning of the story, it's not about that at all. It's about why are we different from animals? Why can't we just eat fruit of the field and frolic naked in the trees, right? And the answer is, well, this is why. We have knowledge they don't have. We have consequences from God because we messed up, right? And now that's it. We're people. So that's and we saw that there's a kind of there's a definition of what is a civilized person as well in Akkadian myth that does parallel some of the things that we saw in our story, even though the driver, as you guys noted, is completely different, because the driver of our story in Bereshit is God's will, right? God says don't do it, and then they do it, and then God's like, well, I don't want them to do this thing, so this is what's happening, and the driver is God's will and God's purpose for man to a certain extent. Whereas in our myth, it's simply what happens to Enkidu. He's a wild man, and so other people need to civilize him, right? And this is how you do it. This is what it means to civilize someone, right? Without any particular purpose, but other than to draw him into human society, right? We can't have this just wild man roaming around with gazelles. It's not going to go, right? And so it's interesting. It's sometimes very interesting to see when we compare these texts with the parallels that we find, how different the basic idea or the basic purpose, the basic drive of the story is. So I'll give you another example. Like if you look at creation myths, in general, creation myths in the ancient Near East explain where the gods come from. That's what the creation myths, they're like, where do the gods come from? And here's the story. They tell you where the gods come from, right? Whereas our creation story doesn't say anything about where God comes from. Nothing whatsoever, nothing, right? It's where's the world coming from? Why is there creation, right? And it's a completely different outlook on what are we wondering about. I a lot of times think that the questions that we ask are actually the greatest reflection of our worldview, not the answers, but the questions. What's a problem for us? What do we want to know? What's super important? That tells us something about the basic approach that we're already coming to things with. So I hope you enjoyed that. If there are no more questions, I will conclude for the night. Thank you for joining me. Again, please, if you scroll up in the comments, my email is there. If you're not on the email list, or if you want to know where the link is for the Facebook group, you don't have to get on the email list. It's enough to be in the Facebook group. You can drop me an email, say which you want, and I will send you the information or put you on the list. So thanks. And next time we will discuss the flood. I might figure out a way to combine Genesis 6 with our discussion of the flood. I'm not sure we're going to have time. So I'm looking forward to seeing you next time, Sunday at 8. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Miriam.
Bye.
Bye-bye.